Chapter 3 of Alexander the Great by Ada Russell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3 Alexander as Prince. Alexander the Third, the Great, was, as we have seen, born at Pella in the autumn of 356 B.C., while Philip was busy outwitting the Athenians in Chalcidice and annexing its towns. He had just taken Potidæa when three pieces of good news were brought to him. One was the victory of his chariot in the races at Olympia. The second was a great slaughter of the Illyrians by a Macedonian army, and the third was the birth of his son and heir, Alexander. The chief omen which marked the night of the boy's birth was the burning down of the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Some courtier of Alexandria afterwards said that Artemis was so occupied on that night with what was going on in Macedonia that she forgot her own affairs, but the people of Asia read a deeper significance into the event. A story was invented that a madman had destroyed the splendid building, and when asked his reason, replied, "Only to make my memory immortal by a great crime." And the soothsayers, they said, had prophesied that somewhere in the world at that hour a man had been born who should utterly destroy Asia for a similar reason. Alexander was not a madman, but he was certainly born to inflict a great deal of evil upon Asia, and so this tale is of interest. His childhood, as well as his manhood, was dominated by the dream of conquering the Persian Empire. Many are the stories, some no doubt true, many of them legends, told us of Alexander's youth, and it is curious that although he was Olympia's only child, we should have no single anecdote of mother and son in these early years. His foster mother, a noble Macedonian woman named Helenice or Lanice, daughter of Dropidas, held the first place in his infancy, and probably continued to do so. Her brother Clytus was afterward one of his chief generals. When a Greek boy was about 6 years of age, his school life began, and Alexander's education seemed to have followed the regular course. He had for governor his mother's kinsman, Leonidas, and for inferior instructor and attendant, pedagogue as the Greeks called it, the Archarnanian Lysimachus, while another Archinanian, Philip, had charge of his health and afterwards accompanied him to Asia as his physician. Anaximenes, then or later, taught him rhetoric. Leonidas, perhaps instructed by the prince's father, gave the boy a Spartan's training, searching his chest to see that no unnecessary luxury had been put into them, and severely repressing extravagance. Once he stopped the child as he was throwing handfuls of incense on the fire at a sacrifice, and told him, "Thus you may sacrifice when you have conquered the regions where frankincense grows." Alexander had evidently been chattering about his future great deeds, and was annoyed at his master's lack of confidence in him. Some years later, when his dreams had come true, he sent many £100 worth of perfumes from Asia to Leonidas, with the injunction, "Be less stingy in sacrificing to the gods, for, as you see in my case, they repay generously gifts cheerfully made." Alexander was taught, like Frederick the Great, to sleep little. Like a young Spartan, he scorned the adornment of his body, caring for nothing but its hardihood and suppleness, and eternally exercising it. His one coquetry was his armor. From the remark of Leonidas about the incense, we know that his earliest days were filled with ambitious dreams of a well-defined nature. One day, after marvelous wars and journeys, he would become lord of Asia, and he grew increasingly uneasy at the extent of his father's conquests, and could hardly contain his rage when the Asiatic scheme came to be mooted. That was not to come for a few years, but meanwhile he informed his companions, Ptolemy, Nearchus, Phrygius, Lysimachus, and Harpalus, that his father would leave nothing great for them to do when they were grown up, and when the court was rejoicing over some new victory of King Philip's, Alexander would sit by in moody silence. When he was 7 years old, they say, he carefully questioned some Persian satraps who had come to the court at Pella. how many days' journey it was from Macedonia to the Persian capital, what sort of king Artaxerxes was, and what sort of an army he had. He would seldom engage in useless amusements or youthful competitions, and when it was suggested that he ran swiftly enough to win a prize in the Greek games, he said, "I would compete if I could have kings for my antagonists." At the age of 13, Philip seems to have considered that Alexander's was too high and fine a spirit to remain under the control of pedagogues any longer, and needed the most skilful management if his character was not to be spoiled. It was now time for Aristotle of Stagira, son of a court physician of Macedonia, to be called in. At Alexander's birth, Philip, it is said, wrote straightway to Aristotle, "I announce to you the birth of my son. I do not so much thank the gods that he is born, but because his birth happened in your time, by whom he may be trained and taught. Nor, I hope, will he be unworthy of either of us, nor unequal to the control of my kingdom. For I would rather be childless than be the unhappy father of a child who should bring dishonor to his race." Thus, in 343 B.C., Aristotle, not yet as famous as he was to become, was invited to try his hand at forming a model ruler, as Plato and Sicily had had the opportunity of forming a model state. From his own point of view, Aristotle was to fail as utterly as Plato. Philip might well feel secure now that he had obtained a tutor like Aristotle for his son. The philosopher was a gracious, graceful personality, a courtier and the son of a courtier, able to teach Alexander the ways of men as well as the contents of books. In all branches of human learning, the saying is still, "Go back to Aristotle," and Alexander is said to have testified that from his father Philip he had received life, but from Aristotle the knowledge of how to live well. Philip gave them a schoolhouse at pleasant Maesa, where Aristotle's stone seats and shady walks were shown for long. Aristotle may have given Alexander his copy of Homer. He is said to have corrected the manuscript, and in the 3 or 4 years which he spent on the education of Alexander and his friends, he must have thrown new light on the whole of literature, politics, and religion. He probably remained enthroned in his pupil's imagination as an authority on literature and religion, but Alexander never paid any attention to his political ideas. Aristotle had no political adaptability. He had been brought up in a Greek city-state, and the Greek city-state remained for him the one perfect form of government. He believed that it should be so small that one man could address all the citizens, and they might all be well known to one another. There is much to be said for the small state in the interests of ideal government, but there are possibilities of justice and virtue under other forms of rule, and to these possibilities Aristotle was blind. He does not even consider the empire in his politics. The Persian realm, which lay like a waxing moon round Greece, was to him merely a congregation of slaves under a slave driver. He believed that Asiatics were by nature slaves, and he advised Alexander, in a treatise on monarchy, to treat them as such. But on this point at least the pupil was a greater statesman than the master, and when he became king of Asia, Alexander put Greek and Asiatic on a footing of absolute equality. How he came to it we do not know. Perhaps it was from his father, but Alexander, alone in his age, conceived the great doctrine of the brotherhood of man. It is not to be conceived that Aristotle was ignorant of the notion, for he must have turned every human institution about in every light. But like Plato, he deeply disapproved of it, both theoretically and because in 5th century Athens, cosmopolitanism had meant deterioration. Foreign merchants had handed and departed in streams at Piraeus, and the adaptable citizens had speedily taken to imitating their ways, with the result that the moral foundations of the state had been threatened, for already in that early age men adopting new manners and customs began to question the existence of a universal right and wrong. So deeply did Plato feel the danger from this that he would not have had a city built on the coast for fear of the visits of foreigners. To him and to Aristotle, the inland valley of the Eurotas where Sparta reigned, was the ideal situation for a virtuous state. Alexander in Asia was in a false position from Aristotle's point of view, and he could give him no reasonable advice. We can imagine him discovering with horror that this boy, whose opinions were one day to be of such importance, had ideas of politics into which his own beloved city-state entered not at all. And it is strange to picture his position in the Macedonian court when it was humming with the excitement of Philip's Asiatic plans. Aristotle's political ideas do not seem to have influenced Alexander in the slightest, and in revenge in after years, when Alexander was conquering the world and Aristotle at Athens was continuing his politics, the latter persisted in omitting the empire, as if too big a monstrosity to notice, from his considerations of forms of government. It is strange, again, that Aristotle took no notice in his scientific writings of the new fauna discovered in Alexander's journeys. In effect, there seems to have been a complete breach between the philosopher and his pupil. When Alexander set out for Asia, however, they were still on good terms. The young king is said to have invited his master to accompany him, to have given him vast sums for his scientific pursuits, and furnished him with 1,000 naturalists to carry out the details of his investigations. Aristotle's treatise on monarchy was addressed to Alexander, and his work concerning colonies was written as advice to him. On the whole, however, the man to whom the world traces back most of its intellectual notions, and the man who altered the whole course of Western history, brought into the closest contact in an important relation, had remarkably little influence on each other's lives. That Alexander had great knowledge of geography, engineering, and science generally appears in his life, but he was clearly enough not an all-around genius. Montaigne said that it was possible to conceive of Socrates in the place of Alexander, but not of Alexander in the place of Socrates. Most people would find it hard to imagine either of these things. There is an amusing story of Alexander writing from Asia to chide Aristotle for publishing books on esoteric philosophy. "You have not done well," ran the letter, "for wherein will your pupils be above others, if those things which you have secretly taught us be made common to all? I assure you I would rather excel others in learning than in dominion." Aristotle may well have thought that Alexander's actions belied his words, but he did not say so. Instead, he returned a polite and soothing missive, saying that these books were published and yet not published, for as Socrates had taught the world, no man can learn anything which he did not know already. Alexander perhaps meant what he said about preferring letters to warfare, and had realized early that his life was not his own. In stormy times, he to whom the book is dear may bear the sword but not the crown, and when Alexander lived, the national existence of Macedonia, and the expansion which was vital to her, depended on the king's practical activity. Throughout his life he loved Homer. A copy of the poet's work was kept under his pillow with his sword, and he bestowed on it a gorgeous case from the spoils of Darius's tent after Issus. One day, when a messenger came running to announce a victory, he said, "By the joyful expression of your face, one would say that Homer had risen from the dead." When far away in Asia, he wrote home for books, and received copies of nearly all the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and various books of dithyrambic hymns to Dionysus. Whether due to the imagination of his biographers or no, Alexander seldom speaks except, like Plato's Spartans, in some brief compact saying worthy of remark. The incident of Bucephalus probably occurred when Alexander, at the age of 16, about to be plunged into the affairs of state, was discontinuing Aristotle's tuition, although his master continued to live in Macedonia until after his accession, then retiring to Athens to make the Lyceum and the Peripatetics famous. The Thessalian Philonicus brought the beautiful charger Bucephalus to Pella to offer him to Philip for the fancy price of nearly 3,000 pounds. Thessaly was a famous breeding place for horses, and the king was accompanied by the prince and many of the nobles when he went out into the field to see trial made of the black steed with a white star on his forehead. To the general disappointment, he appeared vicious and unmanageable, and was so far from suffering himself to be mounted that he would not bear to be spoken to, but turned fiercely upon all the grooms. Philip was displeased at their bringing him so wild and ungovernable a horse, and the animal was being led away, when Alexander, who had observed him well, said, "What a horse they are losing for want of skill and spirit to manage him." As Philip took no notice of this forwardness, pretending not to hear, he kept repeating his remark, and finally his father said, "My boy, you find fault with your elders as if you could manage the horse better yourself." "That I certainly could," answered Alexander. "We'll have a try," said Philip, "but if you can't ride him, what forfeit will you pay for your presumption?" "The price of the horse," replied his son. The company laughed. The king and prince settled the forfeiture, and Alexander ran toward Bucephalus. Taking the bridle, he turned the horse to the sun, for he had discovered that the shadow which fell before him as he moved frightened him. While the animal's rage and agitation lasted, he merely talked softly to him, stroking him gently. But when he felt him beginning to grow eager, he slipped his mantle to the ground, vaulted lightly upon his back, and without whip or spur set him going with a light pull of the reins. At last the anxious spectators saw the prince and Bucephalus flying along like the wind, and they recognized that it was indeed a fine horse, but they were speechless with fear for Alexander's safety. They were amazed when Alexander turned and rode him back, the horse quivering with excitement, but docile as a child. Cheers burst forth, but his father wept for joy, and kissing Alexander said, "Seek another kingdom, my son, more worthy of your abilities. Macedonia is too small for you." Macedonia was too small for either of them or for the Macedonians. In this remarkable and immortal way, Alexander had shown a future ruler of the highest kind. He was all his life to be feared, obeyed, and loved, and bullying was to enter little into the matter. In this year, Alexander was entrusted by his father with the regency of Macedonia, while Philip was vainly attacking Byzantium, and when a revolt of a subject tribe near home broke out, Alexander led an army forth, crushed the rising, and planted the agitated country with colonies, one of which he called, in his presumptive way, Alexandropolis. 2 years later he led the fateful charge at Chaeronea, where he saved, it was said, his father's life, and for long afterward Alexander's oak was pointed out near the battlefield. Philip, who at this time loved Alexander as deeply as he wondered at him, was content to hear his son called king, and himself only general. If the Greeks, however, with their fatal blindness to the trend of events at this time, paid any attention to Alexander's feats, they probably considered him a dashing cavalry officer, and nothing more. It remains to be considered the personal appearance of Alexander at the moment of his accession. He had been brought up to disapprove of athletics, as the excellence of the athlete depended on regularity, while for the soldier's life, such as was awaiting himself, the body must be trained to submit to irregularity. Carefully exercised, however, he became like the typical Greek statue, not extremely tall nor overdeveloped, but perfect in proportion and grace. Once the bloom of boyhood was past, he must have been insignificant-looking, for we are told that on 2 occasions visitors ushered into the royal presence were in doubt as to which was the king. Perhaps his carelessness of dress and deep mental absorption caused this. In 1795, the first sculpture that could claim to be a portrait of Alexander was discovered in Italy, and is now in the Louvre. It shows the classical locks, the straight Greek forehead, with no break of direction at the starting of the hair, and with the slightly aquiline nose in the same straight line, where the large clearly cut mouth and chin recall, without the dimple, the massive beauty of Michelangelo's David. After the discovery of this bust, inscribed Alexander, son of Philip, The Alexander type became better known than had been possible from the vague descriptions of the ancients, and other representations of the conqueror were found. His successors, who used his name as their battle cry, engraved his head on their coins, and beautiful portraits of Alexander, wearing the lion's scalp of the Heraclid sovereigns of Macedonia, are to be seen on the gold medallions at Tarsus. A bronze statuette, now at Naples, is supposed to be a copy of a life-size portrait of Alexander by Lysippus after the battle of the Granicus, a Pompeian mosaic with all the quaintness of drawing of early mosaics, represents him as a warrior at Issus, and he is perhaps to be seen in that battle in the famous reliefs of the sarcophagus of Sidon. From nearly all these sculptures he appears to have approximated to the best Greek types in appearance. His skin, we are told, like that of the original David, was white, with a pleasing flush on cheeks and breast, but his complexion was not like this in the paintings of Apelles, and it is not likely that the warlike Macedonian kept his extreme fairness of face after he left the nursery, nor would it have been considered a beauty at the time. When the Spartan king Agesilaus wished to sell some Asiatic captives as slaves, their clothes found many purchasers, but as to the prisoners themselves, their skins being soft and white on account of their having lived so much within doors, the spectators only laughed at them, while Agesilaus said scornfully to his troops, "These are the persons you fight with." Alexander's lion's mane of hair was yellow and curly, his eyes liquid, and it is said of different colors, the left blue, the right jet black, and his gaze had an extraordinary power both of attraction and command. When he grew up he clean-shaved. His habit of carrying his head a little bent toward the left shoulder has been imitated by aspiring soldiers ever since, and his fault of walking too rapidly for Greek notions of dignity and grace was carefully copied by his successors. End of chapter 3.